Conducting personal interviews with squatters, descendants of miners, and ranchers near the canyon, I've come to realize the story of Lytle Creek is a very interesting one. There are many stories told about this land, many of them true for the consideration of history, but the only true historical moments in Lytle Creek history is the Applewhite Glen feud of 1893. By gathering information from historical records, newspaper reports, and the coroner's inquest over the shooting of the Glen brothers, I offer this, a true story of the Lytle Creek feud of 1893 as told by Alice Keller. There are many stories told about this land, many of them true for the consideration of history, but the only true historical moments in Lytle Creek's history is the Applewhite Glen feud of 1893. It all started with the Mormons. Once the Mormons moved into the city of San Bernardino, they soon started purchasing land. One particular land hadn't been discovered until 1846 by Andrew Lytle of Pennsylvania. He and his battalion were stationed there, but quickly left and headed back to Utah. Once that happened, the Glens moved right on in. They all arrived from Paris, Texas. Silas and Morning Glen, along with their children. The year was 1860. Silas and Morning had 6 children altogether. They ranged from the ages of 18 to 10. Some of them were too young to remember Lytle Creek in its purest form, while others can recall the untainted land. It all began with the death of Silas Sr. and Jeremiah in the year of 1878. Once Miss Morning lost her husband and her beloved son, she had no one to help her out with the ranch. She then had to call on her daughter and her son-in-law, Ruthie and James Applewhite, for help. Morning couldn't even call on her 2 sons, Silas Jr. and John, to help her with the ranch. Both brothers were generally considered worthless and shiftless. However, they both maintained jobs as cattle herders in what's known now as the San Fernando Valley. See, Ruth had married Mr. James Applewhite in 1980, shortly after the death of her brother and father. By the time Ruthie and James returned to the ranch, they had a little family of their own. Once the Applewhites arrived at the Glen Ranch, a notable change amongst the 2 now oldest Glen boys was very obvious. It became very clear that both Glen boys were jealous and feared that their family land would be handed over to their brother-in-law. John Glen had become convinced that his wife had left him not for reasons of him being a bad husband, but because of his nephew, Ollie Applewhite. There were only 2 separate events that led to the death of the Glen boys. One night, the brothers tried to hide in some bushes, waiting for the return of Ollie from work. Once Father Applewhite heard the news from other members on the ranch, he headed north to warn his son of the potential threat. The following day, the Applewhite men were confronted by both Glen boys. The time was 10 a.m. on June 24, 1893, and the sun had risen that day in the most magnificent form. Once confronted, James professed he did not want any fights to go on between the family, but both Glen boys insisted. Once the Glen boys established that they were not going to leave without settling the long family feud, James Applewhite knew without a doubt that the battle would end in death. Screams belonging to Ruth lingered in the background as she pleaded for her 2 brothers to stop. Once the Glen boys said that they were set on killing the son before killing the father, James Applewhite sprang into action. Residents on the ranch recall the shots rang simultaneously. Once James Applewhite ran through the house, John Glen drew his revolver in an attempt to end the life of the young man. But before he can get a shot off, Ollie shot him dead. Another shot rang out, and that belonged to James Applewhite. Silas Jr. had laid on the ground not breathing. By sundown, both Glen men were dead. Following the coroner's inquest, James and Ollie Applewhite were exonerated and set free. The Applewhite family remained owners of Lytle Creek following the death of their mother, Morning Glen, in 1901.